The tragedy of the Harper's Ferry raid and the backlash that followed incited a war between two ideologies, abolitionism and pro-slavery, a war in which abolitionism would be triumphant. The American pro-slavery standpoint had been around since the 17th century and was not uncommon to see being practiced by Southern plantation owners and farmers. The Southern economy relied on slavery to stay stable, and thus supported slavery. The Northerners, however, did not rely on slavery to sustain their economy. After America's victory over Britain in 1783, the Northerners started to think about slavery differently. They started to see parallels between slavery and Britain's rule, which they once found oppressive and unjust. Over time, these views seemed to grow more prominent in the North. The South, being heavily reliant on slavery, detested these new Northern views. When the Continental Congress started to establish a new government, the South went as far as to threaten to leave the American Union if they couldn't have slavery. The South thought the Africans were less than human. They thought that the Africans were savage, barbaric creatures meant to be enslaved so that the so-called master race could prosper. John Brown was born on May 6, 1800, to Owen Brown and Ruth Mills. Owen and Ruth were strongly religious and against slavery. Owen was a Calvinist and worked as a tanner. John's mother passed away when he was 8 years old. His father raised him to believe that slavery was a sin. It is believed that while John traveled through Michigan, he witnessed a young slave boy being beaten by his masters. This is said to be the source of John's hatred for slave owners, as this traumatized him for years to come. He declared this incident to be an eternal war on slavery. Later in life, John would take up his father's legacy. He married Deonthe Lusk, with whom he had many children with. Deonthe passed away in 1832 during childbirth after having her 7th child. He then married Mary Ann Day. John and Mary went on to have 13 children over the next 21 years. Of John's 20 children, only 12 survived past childhood. From the 1820s to the 1850s, John moved around a lot. He tried his hand at many different jobs and ended up in some financial trouble. During this time, he joined and helped many abolitionist causes and movements. John briefly lived in Massachusetts, where he met the freed slave Frederick Douglass. He then settled down in upstate New York in an integrated black community. In 1855, Brown and 5 of his sons moved to Kansas. An act was passed in 1854 called the Nebraska-Kansas Act. This act drew conflict over whether the territory would be a free state or a slave state. After hearing of the Lawrence, Kansas sacking by pro-slavery forces, Brown went on a rampage. On May 24, 1856, Brown and his men entered the pro-slavery settlement of Pottawatomie Creek and killed 5 settlers and wounded several others before his escape. Both the raid on Lawrence and the killings at Pottawatomie set off a war in Kansas. By the end of the year, over 200 people had been killed. This incident made Brown nationally known, but was he a hero or a madman? Harper's Ferry was a small Virginia town in what many settlers who lived in Virginia at the time called the Hole. The small town got its name from the man who offered ferry rides across the Potomac River and is said to have founded the town, Robert Harper. Harper bought the land twice, once from a squatter in 1733, and again in 1751 from the rightful owner of the land, Lord Fairfax. In 1794, George Washington chose the merging point of the Shenandoah and the Potomac Rivers as the site for a federal armory, which was completed 2 years later. By the time of Brown's raid in 1859, Harper's Ferry had become an industrial center for manufacturing weapons. In 1857, John made plans to invade the South. He planned meetings, trained supporters, and surveyed the country around Harper's Ferry, the site of the federal arsenal. He He met with his supporters in Canada and told them of his plan to invade the South. He returned to Kansas and led an attack into Missouri, which resulted in killing one man and taking some slaves back into Canada. The state of Missouri and the U.S. government now considered Brown a criminal and offered a reward for his capture. Many in the North felt differently, though. They saw him as a hero and furthered his support. In 1859, Brown recruited 21 men and rented a farmhouse outside of Harper's Ferry. His plan was to seize the guns, distribute them to the slaves, and start a revolt across the South. Brown had told 3 of the 21 men to stay back and guard the farmhouse. On October 16, 1859, Brown, with 18 men, entered the small town with no resistance. Brown and his men seized the armory. Gunfire broke out early on October 17, 1859. Brown's men were quickly pinned down by local residents and forced to take refuge in the engine house adjacent to the armory. Soldiers soon arrived from surrounding areas. By the end of the day, Brown and his men were surrounded and defeated by military forces led by Robert E. Lee. In the end, 10 of Brown's men were killed, including 2 of his sons, and 7 of his men were captured. Brown's case went to trial quickly, and he was convicted of treason. He was to be executed a month later. In a speech to the court before his sentencing, Brown said, I believe
that to have interfered as I have done in behalf of his despised poor was not wrong, but right.
Several people asked the court to look at Brown's questionable mental state when it came to his actions. He was executed on December 2nd, 1859. Brown's effort to start a rebellion was over in less than 36 hours, but the consequences lasted far longer. In the North, his efforts were admired. Church bells rang on the day of his execution, and songs and paintings were created in his honor. While the North recognized the raid itself as an act of a madman, some admired his courage, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. The Southerners did not see it that way and were outraged. How could the North admire a man who destroyed their property and threatened their lives? Hence, the divide between the North and the South deepened. The South saw John Brown as a symbol of everything they hated and feared about the North. John Brown was called the crazy, fanatic failure. Who was John Brown? Was he a hero, as the North believed he was, or was he a terrorist, responsible for the murders of many farmers in Kansas, Missouri, and attempting to start a rebellion that could have killed thousands? There has been an enormous amount of research on John Brown and his actions. Depending on their views of slavery, his actions could be biased. No matter how you view John Brown, he took a stand against slavery. But his use of violence as a means to end slavery came into question for many years to come. On the day of his execution, John Brown handed a note to his jailer, on which he had written,
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land can never be purged away but with blood.
The note predicted what was to come in the near future. The trial and execution of John Brown pushed the nation ever closer to civil war.
John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. But his soul goes marching